Hello, global gardeners. It's Monday. Don't you just love starting the week talking about gardening? Today, I want to focus on tomatoes. Most of you that are growing tomatoes probably already have them in the ground. For me, this is the first week I've had nighttime temperatures above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius. So this is the first opportunity I've had to even get my tomatoes in the ground. Temperature is a very important factor when we're growing our tomatoes. If you put your tomatoes in too early, when the soil temperature is still too cool, it should be at least 70 degrees Fahrenheit, about 21 Celsius to get your plants in the ground. And those nighttime temperatures should be remaining above 50 Fahrenheit. And ideally, the daytime temperatures are staying below 85 degrees Fahrenheit, about 30 Celsius. Then your tomatoes are going to do fine, even great. But if you get outside those temperature ranges, either when it's too cool or too hot, your tomatoes are not going to grow as well as they could. So we'll discuss more about that. By all means, throw your questions out at me. Let's go ahead and start with a question from Tennessee Nana, who says, "This is my first year growing slicing tomatoes. Is there a different way to take care of them from my cherry tomatoes?" And let's go ahead and tie this in with Laura from Oregon, who says, "I can only grow cherry tomatoes. Happy that I can do that." And so these are related, both of these comments, because for the most part, tomatoes are going to do fine, regardless of whether they're a cherry tomato or a slicing tomato. All tomatoes need the same basic things. They need a lot of sun. More sun is better than less sun. They need consistent moisture. And we'll talk more about that later. And then they need a nutrient rich soil. If you don't have nutrient rich soil, the plants are going to need some fertilizers. And as long as you're providing those basics, the tomato plants are going to do fine. When you choose the varieties that you're growing, you have a choice. And primary choice is usually between the smaller cherry tomatoes and the larger slicing tomatoes. The cherry tomatoes are my favorite, and that's what I tend to grow here in my Colorado garden. I have a short growing season, and like in Oregon, sometimes the season is not long enough to be able to get some of those bigger tomatoes, the slicing ones, the beefsteak ones, to reach the point of harvest because they take longer. The cherry tomatoes are typically going to be the first ones that fruit. So you'll put a cherry tomato in the ground, and maybe 60, 65 days later, you're going to be harvesting some cherry tomatoes. You put one of those big slicing tomatoes in the ground, it might be 90 or 100 days before you can expect to even begin to harvest the first tomatoes. And that's the big difference. Taking care of the plants is going to be the same from one tomato to the next. It's how long you have to give the tomatoes the opportunity to grow and reach harvest that are really the big differences. And so I've tried growing the classic big beefsteak tomatoes that you see in the tomato books and that just look so wonderful to slice. And I have difficulty because my season is just too short. About the time that all those big tomatoes are beginning to ripen, my nights are getting too cold and a frost inevitably strikes before I can get everything harvested. So that's the big difference when you're beginning to grow slicing tomatoes for the first time, is acknowledging whether your season is long enough. If it is long enough, most of the basics are the same. Tomatoes benefit from trellising, and the bigger, heavier tomatoes may need a stronger trellis because those fruits are heavier on the plant. But other than that, it's all pretty much the same. Milltown Life is saying tomatillos is the same cares. Is the care the same as tomato? I struggle with tomatillos. They get leggy and weak. So, yes, basically tomatillos. In fact, I grow tomatillos and tomatoes side by side. It was 2 years ago. I showed it in some of my videos where the tomatillos and the tomatoes are or were in the same bed. When I grew tomatillos at the Galileo garden, I grew them in the same bed side by side because their water requirements are the same, their nutrient requirements are the same, their sun requirements are the same. And so if they're getting tall and leggy, it could be a nutrient issue. And when we talk about the nutrients with the tomatoes and with tomatillos, with the fruiting vegetables in particular, and I say fruiting vegetables, that's a bit of an oxymoron, but the idea is that we want a balance of nutrients. And I prefer to get a nice soil. I've talked about this many times. My soil is loaded with the nutrients, and the plant takes up what it needs from the soil. When you fertilize, the fertilizers that you're typically using, if it's a water soluble synthetic based fertilizer, those nutrients are immediately available for the plants, and the plants are going to take them up immediately. If that fertilizer is high in nitrogen, you're going to get a nice, big, tall plant. You're going to get green leaves, but you're not going to get flowers and you're not going to get the fruit because that nitrogen is promoting the quick growth of the plant. So if you have been growing tomatoes and not getting the fruit, but your plants look great, it could be that you have excess nitrogen, either in your soil or in the fertilizer that you're using. If all other conditions are the same, then you should get a nice, good, solid plant, be it a tomatillo or a tomato. Tomatillos do benefit from two plants. So if you're only growing a single tomatillo plant, you might not get the fruit that you would expect. It really does help to have two plants pollinate each other. But the likelihood of the plants growing well and producing a good harvest is high if you've got that nutrient rich soil or a balanced fertilizer over the course of the growing season. If the plant just isn't growing normally, like getting too tall and lanky, it's usually a nutrient issue that you can trace it back to. Okay, let's get back to. I'm seeing a lot of stuff scrolling by. Big Will Dog, hello to you. Question: I amend my soil with my 1-year-old compost in spring. This year, multiple of the same type of large red tomato plant leaves are abnormal. Any thoughts? And so, abnormal is kind of vague, and the the weather is a big factor. So, if the leaves aren't growing right, if they are misshapen, if they're curled up, that can often be attributed to the weather. It's too cold, it's too dry. If it's a soil problem, generally you're going to see that the plant is overall is not doing well. If there's individual leaves and there's discoloration, if there is something about the leaves that they're like crinkly, that could be. And I had a question that someone had asked me this last week, and we corresponded briefly. If you have a neighbor that's spraying their lawn with an herbicide and some of that spray gets on your tomato plants, it can make the leaves look abnormal. They might grow kind of a crinkly or not fully fleshed out as the full shape of a leaf. That's often a poisoning of the plant with some type of herbicide that might be blowing in. If it's spotty, splotchy, then that often shows that it's some kind of disease that could be taking place. If there are little holes in it, or if you can see some bite marks, then it could be an insect. There are some insects that once they start eating the leaves, then that affects the rest of the growth on the leaf. So it's a lot of different answers to that question, just because abnormal is relative as to what that is, whether it's color or shape or size. And there are a lot of other factors that play into how the tomato plant grows and then how the leaves grow. I like to look anytime I have a leaf problem. And so right off the top of the discussion, yellow leaves at the base of the plant are normal. As a tomato plant grows, it's putting all of its energy into the new growth and then setting flowers and setting fruit. As that happens, the very first leaves, the ones at the bottom of the plant, aren't needed anymore. And often they're shaded, so they're not even producing photosynthesis. So the leaves turn yellow and fall off. Perfectly normal. And that's nothing to worry about. So whenever I have yellowing leaves, particularly at the bottom of the plant, first off, I really don't worry much. But secondly, I look at the top of the plant, the new growth. If the new growth is green and the shape is normal and the plant looks to be healthy, then I'm even less concerned about the yellowing leaves. So if you've got leaves, particularly lower on the plant, that are misshapen and they're not looking right, they're abnormal, look at the new growth. And if the new growth is coming out just fine, then it could be one of those weather related factors, or it could be one of those chemical issues where the plant maybe was affected as those leaves were growing. And then I'm not as worried about it. It's always focusing on the new growth. If the new growth is coming out misshapen, the wrong color, then yes, there's definitely a contamination or a disease at play. And then you just need to do more detective work to try to figure out just exactly what's going on. Mountains and Mayhem says, just planted my tomatoes yesterday. I waited too long, but I've been injured and couldn't amend things, but I'm now healed enough to dig a little. Well, good for you. I'm glad you could get back in the garden. I just put the first of my tomato plants in yesterday, and even in my short season, there's still enough time, plenty of time for my cherry tomatoes. I do have some bigger ones. We'll have to wait and see if the season is going to be long enough for that. But tomatoes, particularly when you choose the best varieties for you that grow well in your area, are very fast to establish in the ground. And if all the conditions are right, you're going to get that fruit. Often it seems earlier than expected. So when you look at a seed packet, or sometimes on the plant tag, it'll tell you how many days to harvest or how many days to maturity. And that is the time from when you put it in the ground, the time that the plant is actually getting established and beginning to grow in the garden. So if you start your seeds indoors 6 to 8 weeks generally before the last frost date, the clock hasn't started yet. And so if you're growing like one of those bigger tomatoes that takes 100 days to harvest, the clock doesn't start when you put the seed in soil inside under lights. The clock starts when it's in the ground and actively growing. And I've had people ask me about that, that I started the seeds and never got the fruit. And the question has to be, what kind of variety was it? And did you have enough time from when it went in the ground? And so I choose 70-day varieties for the most part that tell me I should be harvesting at about 70 days after I put the tomato in the ground and it starts growing. But it seems like, particularly with those wonderful cherry tomatoes, they might be a 70-day variety, and I'm actually harvesting at the 60-day point. The guidance that you'll get from these nurseries and the seed packets is an average, and it's based on good conditions over the course of the life of the plant. If the conditions are great, you can expect that you could have some tomatoes before that date that was on the seed packet. If you have a cold, wet summer like I did last year, then you can expect it's going to take longer for the harvest to hit because the tomato's not getting those hot, sunny conditions that it really wants. So those are some factors when you're looking to harvest to try to keep in mind. I encourage that you get a calendar or enter it in your phone. 70 days, assuming you're planting a 70-day variety, 70 days from when you put it in the ground, make an annotation on your daily planner that it's about time to harvest, especially for those longer, bigger seasons or longer seasons needed for those bigger tomatoes. I think that becomes important because when we get closer to harvest, there's always that question: is it ready yet? When should I harvest? If you have a general idea of how many days it's going to take, that'll get you out in the garden looking. And then you can start making some of the assessment of the fruit itself. Color is no longer the primary factor when it comes to harvesting a tomato. We used to, all of us, grow red tomatoes, and all you had to do was wait until the tomato turned red and then you harvested it. This year, I'm growing Aunt Ruby's German green tomato. When it is fully ripe, it is still green in color. I'm growing a white Tomasol tomato. When it is fully ripe, it is white, slightly yellow in color. Neither of those will ever turn red. And so as you start growing different types of varieties, like even the Cherokee purple is not really purple, and it does have green on its shoulders. Knowing what color to look for is helpful, but gone are the days when you just waited for a tomato to turn red, because we're growing so many different types of tomatoes now. One of the best ways that I find to determine is to squeeze it, gently squeeze the tomato. If it's hard, rock solid hard, like a green tomato is, it's not ripe yet. But if it starts to give just a little bit, go ahead and harvest it. That's usually the point that is showing it's perfectly ripe. If you squeeze and it's really squishy, it's gone past the point of ripeness, and you can use that as a guideline for exactly when to choose it. The LR978 raises a good point as well. I harvest at first blush, otherwise I lose too much to insects. And so letting the fruit ripen on the plant, I think, is the best way to get full flavor, because in the sun, on the plant, all of those chemicals within the tomato are going to give you the fullest, richest flavor. But you can also harvest tomatoes early, and this makes them relatively unique in the gardening way that we grow, because you can harvest a carrot, you can harvest a lot of other plants, and they're done. They're not going to ripen anymore after you harvest, but a tomato will. And the key is the blush point. As the tomato begins to change color, and so if it is a pink tomato, a red tomato, an orange tomato, a purple tomato, a black tomato, when it moves from the dark green stage, it begins to shift. It gets a blush of color that begins to show on the skin. Once you hit that blush point, you can harvest it and take it inside and put it on your counter, and it will continue to ripen and change color. The texture is going to be slightly different than if you had let it ripen on the plant. The taste is going to be a little bit different than if you had let it ripen on the plant, but it's still going to taste like you would expect it to taste. It's going to look like you would expect it to look, and you don't have to worry about some of those things like pests that might eat the plant or cause damage to it. For me, I do that as well. At the end of the season, I will harvest a lot of the fruit once it's reached that blush point, because my nights are getting too cold and my days are starting to get shorter and the frost threatens. So be aware of that you don't have to leave the tomatoes on the plant all the way up to harvest. You can harvest them early and benefit from a ripe fruit without whatever that damage would happen to take place. So, hey, Tony, nice to see you again today. I'll give a shout out to Yankee Sister Homestead, Colorblind Gardener, Gina McGregor. It's also nice to see you. And of course, Jay is right on top of things, our fantastic moderator. Colorblind gardeners saying that is what I do. Give it a little squeeze. Obviously, color doesn't help much with me. As the colorblind gardener, I appreciate that. Thank you for that input. Yeah, and that's I think that's actually very good information to add to this discussion. Not all of us gardeners can look at the fruit and recognize that the color has changed and that it has reached that point. So thank you for pointing that out. The little squeeze really is a good way to determine when you can begin harvesting. And even with that blush point, if you're not able to discern that color change, that beginning of the blush, the texture, the firmness of the fruit is going to change during that blush period. It's not going to be as hard and firm as a fully green tomato that hasn't even begun to ripen yet. So squeezing is definitely going to be a nice option. Laura's saying, looking forward to seeing all those varieties. Yeah, I've got so many cool varieties. For those of you that don't know, and I'm sure Jay will put it up here in a link, I made a video a number of months ago where I said that this year I'm growing all new varieties in my garden. Everything in my garden this year is a variety that I've never grown before. And it's about 3 dozen different varieties of squash and carrot and melon and pepper and tomato. So I have about a dozen different tomatoes that I'm growing, all different varieties that are new. I've got purple ones and white ones and green ones and orange ones, red ones. It's actually, I'm looking forward to it as well. And so to answer your question, DLR 978, there were actually 2 videos. So in the first video, I said, this is what I'm going to do. And I asked for input. I asked viewers to give me suggestions of which ones I should grow. And then I had about 200 suggestions, took all the suggestions that some of you even had given me, and went through the list to see which ones could grow in my Colorado garden, which ones I could actually get access to, because some of them I couldn't even find a source to buy, and then narrow down the list. And so I made a second video where I highlighted all of the varieties I chose, and then even highlighted the name of the viewer that suggested it. So I can't tell you off the top of my head the 3 dozen varieties that I'm growing, but I do have that video from a couple months ago where I show every single variety and the seed packet, and some of them are already in my garden growing right now. So it's really going to be fine. And then there's the link. Thanks, Jay. Find out what I'm growing this year thanks to you. That's the video that lists all of the ones that I actually chose and that I'm going to be putting in the garden. So it's a lot of fun. It's really no different. And the reason I decided to do this, especially with the tomatoes, there are some varieties of tomatoes that I just love. You've heard me talk about black Krim before. That's been my favorite tomato for many years. And so every year I would grow black Krim. When you choose your favorite tomatoes, generally it's because it's a tomato that does well in your garden. So in my Colorado garden, very hot in the summer, very cool in the fall, very cool in the spring, lots of extremes. And so a tomato that tends to be able to handle the varying weather that I have here in Colorado is going to do better in my garden. Black Krim is a perfect example of that. There have been many other tomatoes that I've tried over the years that just haven't done as well. Black Krim is also, because it's one of those that I recommend, a tomato that I know many gardeners have great success with, but not everybody. There are some regions where the black Krim just doesn't do as well. My son lives in Louisiana, and we were talking about tomatoes over the weekend, and he was talking about a Creole tomato, a different type of tomato that they can grow in Louisiana because they have higher humidity. Their conditions are completely different than what I have in Colorado. So as you grow more and more tomatoes, trying to find the varieties that do best for you is a journey. You have to search, you have to try different things. Some will fail, some will succeed, and along the way, you continue growing the ones that do well. That's what I've done with Sun Gold and Sweet 100 and the Black Crim. I grow those all the time because they do great and I love the flavor. This year, I wanted to try to find some of those other possibilities, some of other varieties that could also do well in my garden and maybe challenge Black Crim as my favorite. And so that's why I did it. It's still growing tomatoes in the same way that I've always grown tomatoes. It's just growing different varieties, hoping to find something that is just so great that it'll be in my garden from here on out. And so next year, I'll probably grow Black Crim again, and I'll grow my black cherry again. I just love the black cherry tomato. And I'll probably grow one or two from this year that I really like, maybe even more than that. So we'll just have to wait and see. So challenge yourself when it comes to the varieties. There's nothing wrong with growing the same tomato that you love year in and year out. I've been doing that for a long time, but there may be something else out there. And especially when another gardener in your area recommends something, take that advice. If there's somebody that lives near you that has the same weather patterns that you do, and they tell you about a tomato that does great in their garden, chances are it's going to do great in your garden too. And so those are probably the first ones to try if you want to try something new, is to try something that was recommended to you by a local gardener or a nursery. Just because it's being sold in the garden center does not mean it's going to do well in your area. Here in my part of Colorado, if you go to the big box stores, to the garden centers, and you see all of the selections of plants, those plants, at least for me, come from nurseries hundreds of miles away. And that's no guarantee that they're going to do well with our climate in our particular weather patterns just because it's being sold at the big garden center. They're being distributed through many states, and they're just showing up in the store and being sold whether they're going to survive well or not. Going to a local nursery with gardeners who live and garden near you is really a better way to try to find some of those newer varieties and maybe have a little more success with them. Mike W. is saying, I just went with the proven varieties of tomatoes this year. My attention is on new varieties of other veggies and some experiments. There you go. Nothing wrong with that at all. I think new varieties and experimentation in any aspect of your garden is a great way to approach it. So good for you. Sherry saying, my best here have been the Marzanos, but friends have recommended Principe de Bourgeois for drying. All advice for a humid climate are welcome. And so good point. I've grown San Marzanos before, and they've done okay in my garden. I haven't done the other, but a humid environment is going to be better for some tomatoes than mine. My humidity will get down to single digits in the summer. And so I need to have those tomatoes that can handle the dry conditions. And when you discover them, then it's one of those things, keep it in your toolbox and keep growing it. Liz G says, it's so cool the way you challenge yourself and open your garden up to new possibilities. Well, thank you. I try to do this a little, so I mix known with unknown plants. And that's the way I've always done it. And that's the way I recommend, Liz, is try a little bit new and keep doing the stuff you know is going to work, because we like to have that success in our garden at some point. At the end of the season, we want to be able to harvest something. But yeah, this year I just decided to go all in and try something new. And I'll be making more videos, of course, as we get to the end of the season, so you can see the results of it. And it's kind of exciting as we look or as I look forward to moving in next year's garden with choosing the varieties. Karen at a garden for all seasons is saying, looks like we're skipping warm and going directly to hella hot. Yeah, we had that last week in Dallas, Texas. Will a lower percentage shade fabric balance the temperature and light requirements? Thinking of using grow lights. So absolutely. I have a video of a couple years ago that the videos about weather protection. But in that, I show how I do my hoops and how I cover the hoops with the shade cloth and with other materials, depending on what weather I'm trying to protect my garden from. And shade cloth is part of that process. So I like the sturdy cattle panel hoops over my vegetable garden beds, and I will pre-cut shade cloth and drape it over those hoops for our very hot, dry, windy weather that I have here in Colorado. And it does make a big difference. So when you're looking at your tomatoes, 85 degrees, I think I might have mentioned that, about 29 Celsius. That's an ideal high end of temperature. When the tomato is growing between about 55 degrees Fahrenheit and 85 degrees Fahrenheit, it loves it. It's very happy. 13 degrees Celsius to about 29 Celsius, that's the ideal zone for tomatoes. When it gets above that, and particularly when it gets above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, about 32 Celsius, it's too hot. And most tomato varieties will either drop their flowers when it gets that hot, and or pollination will cease with any flowers that are remaining on the plant. It's just too hot for the pollen. And so you're not going to get the fruit development when it gets that hot. Putting the shade cloth over the plants keeps it cooler. The air temperature is still warm, but you don't have that sun beating down on it. And particularly in the morning, it stays cooler longer. So your plants are going to cool off at night, and then the sun comes up and they're going to warm up, and then they're going to get hot during the peak of the afternoon. Well, the shade cloth, particularly during the morning hours, are going to keep those temperatures lower. So pollination is more likely to happen. The fruit set is more likely to happen because the plant isn't getting so hot so quickly that all of that activity is taking place when it's still relatively cool. And so it makes a huge difference. The thing about the shade cloth, as I show in that video, is I don't cover the entire hoop. It's not side to side. It's only the covering the top portion so that it's shaded during the hottest point of the day when the sun is directly overhead. The plants are still getting enough light from the side, and I typically use a 30% shade cloth. At the peak of the day with the sun directly overhead, I'm lessening the light by 30%, but that's still more than enough. So I wouldn't necessarily think that you would need to use grow lights for anything that's growing outside, as long as you're allowing the sun to come in. And even with a 30% shade cloth, it's still getting enough light if it's in a full sun area. But you don't even need to cover it. Just the protection during the hottest part of the day can make a big difference when you're looking at the tomatoes in particular. And more sun is better. It really is. The harshness of the sun is really the key component when we're talking about protecting our plants. And many of us can get by without that protection if you're choosing a variety that can handle the extreme heat. Some of those tomatoes that are being grown in the southern United States during the summer are really strong, hardy plants. Many southern gardeners just don't grow tomatoes during the summer because it's too extreme. My brother lives in Arizona. They can't grow tomatoes during the summer because they have triple digit heat it's so hot and so dry that no tomato plant is going to be able to handle those conditions and pollinate and fruit. So they grow in the shoulder seasons in spring and fall to get their tomatoes. And that's another aspect when you're choosing your garden and the plants within it is what kind of season you have. I have to grow in the summer because my spring and fall are too cold. If you live in like a zone 8 or zone 9, you might be able to garden most of the year because the temperatures are not going to be as cold when the tomato is beginning to reach that full maturity point. That's when if you're growing an indeterminate tomato plant, you can have a plant that's 12, 14, 15, 18 feet long. They'll continue to grow, continue to grow, continue to grow as long as it's sunny and warm. And if you live in an area that's nice and sunny and warm for a long time, don't think that your tomato season has to end in September or early October like it does for many of us. You might be able to get a season extending even into November. And now knowing that you can harvest the fruit just after that blush point, I know gardeners that are harvesting tomatoes and eating them fresh on Christmas. So not all of us have those conditions, but it is a possibility. Kevin DeBell is asking, I have some seeds that haven't sprouted yet, all planted at the same time. Should I assume they failed? Should I reseed? So it depends on the seed, depends on how long. If some of them germinated and sprouted and other seeds right next door in the soil didn't, then I would say that there was a problem with those seeds because there's usually not that big of a delay. Sometimes peppers in particular, and hot peppers, can have a week or 10 days between germination of seeds that are all started at the same time. That's about the most extreme that I've encountered is with hot pepper seeds. Almost all other seeds are going to germinate and sprout within a few days of each other, assuming they were all sown at the same depth. If a seed is deeper in the soil, it's going to take longer for it to emerge. So if you had the seeds at different levels in the soil, that could take longer for all of them to emerge. But if some of them germinated and started growing and nothing else did within the same week, I would say that there was a problem with those seeds, and reseeding is probably a good idea. And even if you reseed and those first seeds suddenly germinate and grow, well, that's not a problem. It just means you have extra plants that you're going to have to thin out. But more likely, there was an issue, and the reseeding is going to give you the plants that you're actually hoping for. So I do that regularly, where I'll be starting a patch of beets or turnips or lettuce or spinach, and there's a gap. I will sow the seeds pretty evenly and pretty regularly, and then occasionally there's a gap. There should be a plant there, and there's not. Go ahead and just put some new seeds in. It'll mature at a different rate, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's like succession planting, where you're harvesting one group of plants that were the first ones to go in, and the second series of plants are waiting to reach maturity. And so a week or two later, you harvest those plants, and you have a longer season of harvest when you stagger the seed plantings like that. Okay, it's so nice to see everyone here today. Greg is saying, regarding the heat, what is the threshold for using shade cloth? For example, is one day with a high of 90 enough, or is it really once you start to see multiple days in a row at 90 plus? It's really regular days. A single weather event is going to impact some of the flowers on the plant, but it's really not going to make that big a difference. We're talking about sustained temperatures. And so for me here in Colorado, it is unusual for me to get temperatures above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 Celsius, but it occasionally happens. Usually in late July or the beginning of August, we'll have a week, maybe two. Sometimes it occasionally gets into 3 weeks where we will have temperatures in excess of 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 32 Celsius. And that's when the shade cloth comes out. Before that point, it bounces up and down, and I don't even worry about it. But it's the sustained temperatures that really do make a difference in how well the plants are going to grow. And that's when I put the shade cloth out and keep it out. I might, if we have a thunderstorm and the hail is forecast, I might bring the shade cloth out because it's already cut, it's all ready to go, and I'll clamp that to my hoops to protect my plants from the hail, because shade cloth is also great at protecting plants from hail. But then I take it off if we're still in that range where the temperatures aren't hot. It's sustained hot temperatures that you're really going to want to use the shade cloth for. And it's relatively, so I should have a link in the description below. I get asked this occasionally. Haven't seen anybody ask it yet. My hail cloth, my shade cloth, I get all of that from greenhousemegastore.com. And I actually have a link now in the description to greenhousemegastore.com. That's where I get all my perlite. That's where I get all my vermiculite. That's where I get all my pots for starting my seeds. And they contacted me a few months ago and asked if I wanted to become an affiliate and offer a code to my viewers. And I have that now. So you'll see that link, and Gardener Scott is a code that you can use to get a discount on most of their products, I think. And I continue to buy from them because they're in my opinion, and because I've been doing this for years, the shade cloth and all of those kind of materials to help protect your garden, you can buy in bulk at the best prices that I found, and good quality as well, at greenhousemegastore.com. So if you're wondering about how I do that, I've got some videos. Just this week, I put up my hail cloth over my big enclosed garden. So it's 25 feet by 25 feet with beds all the way around. You may have seen that in some of my videos. That whole thing is covered by one sheet of hail cloth. And I got it at Greenhouse Megastore. Then I buy rolls that are, I think most of the ones I have are 8 feet wide. And so I'll get a 50-foot roll of shade cloth that is, I think it's 6 feet wide, 6 feet wide. And then I just cut it to fit the hoops on my raised beds, and then put it in my shed. And whenever I need it, I just pull it out. It's already cut. I clamp it to the hoops, and it's all ready to go. So there you go, Jay. Thanks for that. There's the link to Greenhouse Megastore with the code Gardener Scott. Yeah, that's so nice. There are a number of companies. The greenhouse company, Planta, did the same thing. I bought the greenhouse. There's so many things that I have bought in my garden and then make a video about it because I like the product. And then the company contacts me and gives me a code so that everyone else that watches the videos can get a discount. I didn't get a discount when I bought it, but at least you can get a discount when you use it. Always a nice opportunity if you can save a little bit of money in your garden. Eva Nichols Art, hello to you. I live in Truckee, California, short growing zone, about 80 average frost-free days, hot days, cool nights. Yeah, I know that area well. I grew up in Reno, Sparks, actually. Went to the university there. So Truckee's a wonderful place up in the Sierra Mountains, the Sierra Nevada mountains, but it's a short season. We have areas like that near me here in the Rocky Mountains. And this is when it becomes very important that you choose a variety. So if you've got 80 average frost-free days, perfect opportunity for growing cherry tomatoes, and probably needing some frost protection early in the season. And if you're lucky, you have a system, you can use it late in the season as well. And so just up the mountain at Woodland Park here from me, very similar to Truckee, very similar growing season. And I know a lot of gardeners who are growing tomatoes in those conditions, and almost exclusively they're growing the cherry tomatoes. There are some of the slicers, but they're much smaller. So when you think of a beefsteak tomato, you're thinking of a big tomato. Well, you can get by with smaller tomatoes. And so there's some of those patio tomatoes, like Celebrity is a variety that is very common in this area. They sell them everywhere. And it's a bigger tomato than cherry tomato, still not big, full beefsteak size, but it can grow very quickly and you can reach harvest in a very short season. And I know a lot of the gardeners, in at least at my garden club in this local community, are growing those kind of tomatoes if they want a bigger tomato, because we just never know when that first frost is going to hit. Blue Veil Meadows ALDs has a question. Trying the sunglasses tomato for the first time, transplanted about a month ago, doing well, but this morning I'm pretty sure I spotted blight on the main stem, purple blotch. Sorry to hear that. So let's talk about diseases a little bit, because I did want to touch on that. First off, when we talk about choosing the varieties of tomatoes, and you can find this out, sometimes it's on the seed packet, but when you're choosing your tomatoes, if you order online, you can get more information from the site, the nursery that you're getting your seeds from. When you buy a tomato that's in a nursery or a garden center, look at the plant tag, and there will be little letters on them, like a V for verticillium wilt, and or an F for fusarium wilt. And so the idea is that some varieties of tomatoes have bred within them a, a a genetic ability to fight off some of these diseases. And if you know you have a particular disease like that, choosing a variety that has like VPN at the bottom tells you that it is resistant to some of those diseases. One of the things that almost all of us get is blight. There's early blight and there's late blight. In my garden, I rarely get early blight. I occasionally get late blight. And so this is all part of growing tomatoes, is learning about what kind of diseases you get in your garden and how bad they are, if it's something that you even need to be concerned about, because sometimes the diseases we get in our garden at particular times in the garden aren't particularly that big a deal. Powdery mildew is another one of those that infects most of our gardens. I generally don't get powdery mildew on my squash plants until the very end, about 2 weeks before the frost comes, and so I don't even worry about it. It's not that big a deal. But if it's early blight on a tomato, it might be something to be concerned about. So this is one of those things that if it's a blotch, and a purple blotch may or may not be blight. So this is where the internet is so great, is you can do a search for early blight photos on tomatoes, and you'll be able to see if it matches what you think it is. And then you can take the next step, depending on what diseases you have in your area, as to whether it's something to be concerned about. Often with blight, if we prune off the affected portion, you might be able to keep it from spreading to the rest of the plant. And so if it's caught early and dealt with early, the plant will keep growing and produce, and it'll be fine. If it's later in the development of the disease, before you discover it, sometimes the only solution is to pull up and discard, like throw in the trash the plant. You don't want to throw your diseased plants into your compost pile or use as a mulch in your garden. If it's an identified disease, get rid of it. Just don't even deal with it. That can be difficult, especially if you're growing something for the first time and you notice a disease on it. You want to try to, oh, I'm going to make that plant survive. I'm going to do everything I can to get it to grow. And sometimes you just can't. And you've got to just accept that you pull the plant. Of the diseases, blight is generally the easiest to manage. And I'll let you look online and see all the things that you can do to manage blight. When we are planting our tomatoes, there's some things that you can you can do to reduce the likelihood of disease and to really minimize how the plants are going to be impacted. The first being mulch. Mulch your tomatoes. I like to use straw and crushed leaves and dried grass clippings. Whatever you're using to mulch your tomatoes, do it. Because whether it's a fungal disease, and many of the tomato diseases that we have are fungal, it could be a bacterial disease that occasionally happens. A lot of those are residing in the soil. And so you have those fungal spores that are resting on the surface. So when you water or when it rains, some of those spores are going to bounce up from the raindrop or from the watering. And if they land on a leaf or if they land on the stem, it's possible that you'll start getting a fungal disease. With mulch in place, that's less likely to happen. So by just mulching your tomatoes, you're already reducing the possibility of getting some of those diseases. And if you have had diseases in the past and you pulled the plant out before it infected any others, that's definitely one way that you can prevent it from setting in your garden. I've got one patch in that enclosed garden area, one long bed, and I grow tomatoes in it every year. And I think I showed this in a video maybe last year or the year before. I had one plant that started showing signs of a disease, and I pulled it and discarded it before whatever it was. And there were a couple things I talk about it in the video, a couple possibilities for the disease before it infected either of the plants right next door. The plant was gone, the disease was gone, and that has never come back in my garden. So even though it's hard to pull some of the plants that we suspect are diseased, if you can identify the disease and if one of the controls is to get rid of the plant, then get rid of the plant. And you should be able to keep the disease from reoccurring in your garden. If the next year you have the same disease, this is when rotating the crops may make sense, where you were growing tomatoes all in the same bed year after year, and then disease set in. Now start growing the tomatoes in another bed, because the tomato specific diseases are going to be affecting whatever tomatoes you put in that bed the next year. So just don't put tomatoes in that bed the next year. And it's because I have such a long bed and that's intended for my tomatoes, it'll have some impact because I'll have to find a substitute spot. But as long as you're amending your soil every year, as long as the soil is rich and filled with nutrients, the plants should grow strong. And a stronger plant is more able to fight off some of those diseases. One of the other things we can do, air circulation is very important, particularly with those fungal diseases, to reduce the likelihood of infection. And so I prune off the lower branches on my tomato plant, and I keep up with it. So early on in the plant's life, I like to have the plant growing with about 18 inches of leaves and new growth. So when the plant gets about 2 feet tall, I'll prune off all of the lower branches and leaves that are about 6 feet, or not 6 feet, 6 inches above the soil. So it's a 2-foot tall plant, 24 inches tall. I prune off the bottom 6 inches, and now 18 inches of leaves and branches are growing. As the plant gets another foot taller, I'll prune off more. So the plant, when it's 3 feet tall, I will have pruned off generally about 15 to 18 inches of those lower branches. And I usually stop at about the 18-inch point. If the mulch doesn't work, if the disease is trying to get a foothold in your garden, by keeping the lower branches off the ground and improving the air circulation around the plant, you're reducing the likelihood of disease infecting that plant. And so keep that in mind as well, that when we do this, I'm talking about growing vertically, growing up a trellis, because that's a great way to improve the air circulation, and to reduce a lot of these diseases. You can grow your tomatoes along the ground and just let them sprawl, let the vines grow, and they'll do fine. If you got a big enough spot to handle the growth of a big tomato plant, and wherever that stem is resting on the soil, new roots are going to grow. So as the plant continues to grow, you're going to get new roots to give more support to the plant, but you don't necessarily have that great air circulation. And the disease potential is higher for plants that are resting on the ground and not growing vertically. You can grow more plants vertically because you can space them closer, but you can usually grow plants more successfully on a trellis because you're reducing that risk of the diseases that might find a way. But learn about the diseases, the tomato diseases in particular. The extension service, like Master Gardener Desk, is a great way to find out about what you have in your area. And so here in Colorado, I can go either to the Master Gardener Desk at the Extension office, or I can go online. For me, it's Colorado State University Extension. And there are fact sheets that tell me about the most likely tomato diseases that we have here in Colorado. And you can find the same kind of thing depending on where you're at. In the States, it's going to be the Extension Service. In the UK, the Royal Horticultural Society has the same type of information that you can get access to find out what is the pest or the disease that's most likely to affect your plants. And so if you know what that is, then you are better able to combat it. Sherry is saying, I have an air force of parasitic wasps here. By the time I spot a worm on the tomatoes, the wasps have already laid their eggs on it. That's awesome. And so when I talk about getting to know the pests and the diseases, tomato or tobacco hornworm is a caterpillar that we often find on tomatoes. It's huge. And there are parasitic wasps. I've seen this once in my garden about 20 years ago, and I keep looking for it and have yet to find it happen again. But these wasps will lay eggs in the caterpillar, and the egg sacs develop on the outside. So you'll see this big caterpillar, 3 or 4 inches long, big, thick as a cigar. And then you have these little white egg sacs that are all along the back of the caterpillar. And when it hatches, these eggs hatch, the larva will eat the caterpillar from the inside out. So that's just so cool how nature works. And so having those parasitic wasps is a great thing in your garden because they can deal with some of those caterpillars. Caterpillars can be so difficult to see on our plants. At the Galileo Garden greenhouse, I had a lot of tomatoes growing very tall side by side, and I noticed the damage on the leaves, and it was eaten obviously by a caterpillar, and it took hours to find the first caterpillar. Once we found it, we found a lot more because your eyes kind of get focused on that slight color change. And we were able to hand pick off all the caterpillars or most of them to the point that the damage was minimal beyond that. But caterpillars can be really hard to see. But nature, with those parasitic wasps, really are great allies to have. So that's wonderful. If you know you've got those, then absolutely do everything you can to keep those wasps happy. And that's where a lot of diversity in your garden, growing the flowers and the grasses and the herbs, growing bushes and trees. There are a lot of different plants that attract different insects. And so those parasitic wasps in particular will come to your garden. Many of them are attracted by the umbels, the umbrella-shaped flowers on like a dill or a carrot. Those are great to grow or in your garden and to let flower because they're attracting a lot of these beneficial insects, to include the parasitic wasps. And when you start seeing all these little insects, do what you can to identify them. And once you know you have them, keep them happy, and they will definitely do a good job to to deal with the pests you have. Karen saying, just got the first green stalk. Good for you. Can I grow lettuces and strawberries inside with grow lights? Already bolting outside. Sorry, didn't mean to be greedy with an off-topic question. Not a problem. So yeah, absolutely, you can grow. And so I did a few videos last year with a kindergarten class up in Canada, and they were growing plants in green stock in a classroom under lights. And I didn't have a follow-up video. Jan and I have talked periodically, the teacher, because they had a teacher strike at about the time that the plants were getting ready to harvest. I won't go into that, of course, but the point being, they were able to grow lettuces and a lot of other plants inside under lights in a green stock. You will do better if you have a good hard or high intensity light. And just like those of us that grow green stalks outside, we periodically rotate the green stock tower. And so have a good grow light, not only on top, but you'll need it on the side to make sure you get some of those lower tiers. And then just rotate the plant around or the tower around, and you can definitely grow inside in a green stock. I think strawberries, depending on where you live, may be better indoors in a green stock. I've got one of my green stocks in my greenhouse with strawberries. They're doing far superior than the same strawberries that I planted on the same day outside. So the sheltered conditions, be it a greenhouse or indoors, really are suitable for strawberries in a green stock. And I go to my greenhouse every day. I've been doing this for 2 or 3 weeks now. Every day I'm eating fresh strawberries from my green stock strawberry tower. And it's those sheltered conditions really do make a big difference. And so the light is the biggest factor. If you can figure out the light, and Jan and I talked a lot, the teacher in Canada, about the lighting, and he was able to set up a system with some bright grow lights just angled off to the side, and that was able to cover the whole tower, and it actually worked pretty well. So you might need to experiment a little bit, but it's definitely something that you can achieve success with. Owen's asking, is there probably a benefit to starting seeds that have effective microbes on them or in the immediate root zone? I don't really think so. The thing about seeds is that the seed is going to germinate when the temperature is right, the moisture level is right, and if the oxygen level is right. That's really all that's needed for a seed to germinate. That's why you can germinate a seed on a wet paper towel on top of your refrigerator. It doesn't need soil. It doesn't need anything in the soil. It just needs the right temperature so that it stimulates the seed that conditions are right, and then the moisture level to actually tell the seed that it can survive once it germinates, and then the oxygen because the seed is alive and it'll germinate. Doesn't matter what you've got in the soil, whether there are effective microbes. It doesn't even need to be a nutrient-rich soil. I start most of my pepper and tomato seeds in a seed starter mix that is sterile. It's just perlite and peat moss, no nutrients at all. And the seeds germinate and the plants start growing. It's when the seedlings are growing and when the roots are developing that you really now need to start looking at the soil or the potting mix or wherever it is that you're growing your plant. And in the garden, if you've got lots of organic matter and if you've been building your soil over time, like I recommend, then you're going to have beneficial microbes that are making those nutrients available to your plants. If you're growing with potted mixes, many of them are sterile, even if they've got fertilizer in them. If it's a slow release organic fertilizer, it's going to take a while for the microbes to make those nutrients available for the plants, but those microbes do need to be present. For them to be present, All you got to do is just create that environment of heat and warmth and oxygen, and the microbes are going to populate that space. So I've seen mycelia in particular is sold. There are other materials that you can buy, including some microbes to add to your soil mix. But so many microbes are just naturally occurring all around us that if you just give the right conditions for them to grow, they're going to populate the soil and they're going to make the nutrients available and the plants are going to start growing. The key thing to be aware of when we're talking about microbes in soil, that's my preferred method of gardening, is making those microbes available so my plants will grow. But a new mix of soil or soil that has organic matter that hasn't decomposed completely yet, those nutrients aren't going to be there in the amounts that a full grown plant may need. So, fertilizers may be a necessity for those gardeners who don't have good soil yet. And so young plants, very resilient, they'll end up growing. Even if the soil is relatively poor, the seedlings can still grow. But if you notice that your plants, once they start getting to about that 2 foot size, they're not growing well. The color is wrong. If it is a purple plant when it should be green, that's clearly a nutrient deficiency. There's lots of other signs that the plant will give that shows that it's not getting enough nutrients. That's when, even if you are an advocate for growing good soil, you may need to resort to using some fertilizers in the short term to keep the plant strong and to keep it growing. And that can be very important, make a big difference. I was looking at some fertilizer information over the last couple of days, and the thing about tomato fertilizers in particular is there's no single answer. If you do a search for tomato fertilizer, you're going to see fertilizers of all different types, all different combinations of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And each company is going to say that they've got the best blend for tomatoes. So, I'd love to be able to give you the magic formula for what the mix should be, but everybody has their favorite and it's all a bit different. Early in the growth of the plant, more nitrogen actually is beneficial so that you get the good early growth of the plant. But once the plant becomes an adolescent, the mid phase of its life, you want to cut back on the nitrogen and start focusing more on the phosphorus, which is going to encourage the flower growth and that fruit development. And then, of course, you've got to throw in the potassium all along the way, and that's going to give a good, strong, sturdy growth for the plant. But it's more than just nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. There are many other nutrients, macronutrients and micronutrients that tomatoes need. So calcium is a macronutrient that all plants need, but tomatoes in particular, people think if there's a problem with their plant, it's because they don't have enough calcium in the soil. And you see all kinds of fixes. Water your plants with milk to add calcium. Doesn't work. Don't do it. You're wasting milk. Bury eggshells to get calcium with your tomato plants. Doesn't work. Those eggshells are not going to break down, and it's not in a form of calcium that plants can use. Ultimately, your soil has enough calcium. Almost all soil on the planet has enough calcium naturally in it to be able to support the growth of tomato plants, all plants. The key is that, can the plant absorb that calcium and all of the other nutrients either in the soil or in the fertilizer? And that's the biggest issue. With tomatoes, you want a consistently moist soil. If the soil is too wet or if the soil is too dry, the roots are not going to be absorbing the nutrients. One of those nutrients that's not absorbed is calcium. And so, how can you tell that your watering practices are not what they should be? If your tomato gets blossom end rot, if the flower end, the bottom end of the tomato starts turning brown, maybe even black, and is all mushy, that's blossom end rot. That is a calcium deficiency in the fruit. It doesn't mean that your soil doesn't have enough calcium. It just means that the plant did not absorb enough calcium for the growth of that particular fruit. Chances are the most likely culprit is that the soil dried out or the soil was saturated when that fruit was developing and absorbing calcium. So if you look, it's another one of those things, you'll see all kinds of answers, tips online. How much should you water your tomato plant? So I saw one site that says water your tomato plant 1 to 1.5 inches a week. And there was another site that said water your tomato plant 2 inches a week. And another site that said water your tomato plant 3 inches a week. Well, I didn't look to see where all these different sites were based, but the answer is it depends. If you live in an area where you get regular rain and your humidity is high, you might be able to get by with only watering your tomato with 1 inch of water a week. If you're in an area like mine with the extreme winds and heat and low humidity, I have to usually give at least 3 inches of water to my tomato plants every week. But, and this is where I think some confusion plays in, because depending on your local weather patterns, you'll see gardeners recommend water your tomatoes twice a week, 1/2 inch each time. I've seen this. That will not work in my area. My soil will dry out between that. It may work in your area. So you have to determine your own customized watering and irrigation plan for your garden and for your tomatoes. For me, I have to water every single day in the summer. And I'm putting on about 1/2 inch of water each time I water. So over the course of the week, the plants are getting about 3 inches of water. That's because even with mulch, I have a lot of soil evaporation. And I have to counteract that evaporation by watering more often and by watering more when I do water. That's the plan that I have determined works best for me. There are some times when we start getting into those extreme temperatures for that 1 or 2 weeks of summer, I'll go out after watering in the morning. I'll go out in the evening and physically check the soil. And if the top 1/2 inch of soil is dry, it's not a big deal because the roots are much deeper than that. It just means the next day I'll water a little bit more. If the top inch is dry, and I've had this happen in a single day after watering the top inch, sometimes the top 1.5 inches of soil is dry. I'll give it a second watering of the day so that I help keep a consistent moisture. Because if the top is dry, that dry soil is going to absorb some of the moisture of the soil lower down, and you don't want the soil around the roots to dry out. So you got to figure out your own plan, and you got to water at the rate that works best for you, not for tomatoes only, but for the entire garden. It's just that with tomatoes, if you don't water appropriately, you're going to see blossom end rot, blossom end rot on a tomato. If I don't give my carrots enough water on a day or two in the peak of summer, it's not that big a deal. They might start bolting early, but it's not going to change the texture of the fruit or the flavor of the fruit like it will with a tomato that has too much or too little of water. So just be aware of that. Girl, what's date? Is saying I'm in Texas, where right now we are at 97 degrees. Let's see, that's about 36 degrees Celsius, but can get triple digits. Should I water every day? Also have tomatoes in grow bags. So I would definitely suggest considering watering every day. In grow bags, absolutely. Grow bags are going to dry out even faster than a raised bed, and a raised bed is going to dry out faster than an in-ground bed. So where you're gardening and how you're growing definitely influences how much you're going to water. With a grow bag, this might be one of those things that you might need to water twice a day in 97-degree Texas air. And so get out there late afternoon, early evening, stick your finger in the soil in the grow bag and see how dry it is to determine whether you need that second watering. But absolutely, I am watering all of my containers every single day. And in the summer, my green stock is a good example of this. My green stock, I'm often giving 2 waterings a day because it's a container. And my pots as well, the plants I'm growing in pots, I'm watering twice a day because they just dry out so quickly in that summer heat and low humidity. The the beds that you might be growing in, uh, if you've got tomatoes in other types of beds, particularly in-ground beds, you might not need to water every single day. But the only way to know for sure is to get out there and check it, and then you can be sure that you're doing it right. And the plant will tell you wilting is normal with plants. The transpiration process draws moisture up from the roots to the rest of the plant so the plant can stand nice and erect. When it gets too hot and the plant is concerned it's losing too much moisture, the stomata, the cells in the leaves, are going to close down. Transpiration is going to stop. That flow of water is going to cease, and the plant's going to wilt. Perfectly normal. When conditions cool, those cells are going to open up again. Transpiration is going to start up, and the plant's going to stand back up again. So look for that in the garden over the course of the summer. Tomatoes show it less than other plants, but they still will droop a little bit, but they should perk up in the evening. If they're not perking up later in the day, then that's showing that there's probably dry soil. There's just not enough moisture in the soil to support the 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 plant being nice and erect and firm and growing tall, because it's moisture in the soil that allows that to happen. So look at the plant, let it tell you what's going on, but then also physically check the soil so that you can see what you should uh, modify about your irrigation plan. Serena says, just got my first green stock too. Good for you. I planted royal catchfly in the top planter before reading that it can grow to 4 feet tall. Should I lower it, leave it, or stake it? So since it's probably early, yeah, you could move it down to the bottom tier and then expect that you're going to have to support it as it grows taller. I if it's in the top of the planter, it's probably going to flop over and not be what you were expecting it to be. But it's nice thing about the green stock, those can be heavy tiers once they're filled with soil, but they're definitely interchangeable and you can remove and stack as needed. Uh, if you have the ability to stake it, and by leaving it where it is and put some type of trellis or wires or stakes from the top, well, sure, that sounds like a relatively easy way to deal with it without having to restack it. So I would say it depends on whether you can support it as it grows, either from the top or from the bottom, and which would be easier. And that would influence my decision of whether I would move it or not. And that way, uh, it I like to keep it easy and simple and as lazy as possible, and that has a big impact on how I decide what I'm going to do at different times in the garden. Um, I also want to talk about, before we end here soon, what you're going to do with your tomatoes. So growing the tomatoes is relatively easy. We've talked about the fact that the sun is important. Full sun is good, but too much sun can inhibit the fruit set. The soil nutrients are important, but the nutrients aren't enough. You might need to supplement with some fertilizer. We've talked about some of the diseases. We've talked about the nutrients and the irrigation. If you've done all of the things that you should be doing, and it's not that hard because millions of us are growing tomatoes successfully. It's just identifying the little tweaks we can make here or there to improve how we grow. But when it gets to the point of harvest, what are you doing with your tomatoes? Now, I love fresh tomatoes. I've got 3 tomato plants that are growing in my greenhouse right now. I've got the uh, the green tomato I was telling you about. I've got a hillbilly tomato, which is a bigger tomato. Never grown it before, but because it's a bigger tomato, I thought I would try growing it in my greenhouse because I'm not sure if my season is going to be long enough outside the greenhouse, but I'll also be growing hillbilly outside. And then I have a strawberry cherry tomato that's supposed to be really prolific. And I put that in the greenhouse because I learned last year I grew black cherry tomato in my greenhouse. It was so prolific. I had cherry tomatoes every single day past the point of my first frost. Even I was harvesting black cherry tomatoes here in my Colorado garden into the beginning of November last year. So I chose the plants for my greenhouse for a couple reasons. One being that the the time period that I can get a longer harvest in the greenhouse is advantageous, especially if it's going to take longer for that big fruit to develop, but also because I like to eat fresh tomatoes, especially those cherry tomatoes. So when you're looking at your harvest and how you're going to use the tomato, do start thinking well beforehand what you're going to do with the tomatoes. Many of us love the taste of tomatoes. We grow a lot of tomatoes, we harvest a lot of tomatoes, and then we realize we have more tomatoes than we can eat. If you get into that situation, what are you going to do? Freezing the tomatoes are an option. Dehydrating the tomatoes are an option. Freeze drying are an option. I definitely do all those. Pickling. I pickled some cherry tomatoes last year. I wasn't real thrilled with the texture and the flavor, but they were good in salads. So pickling tomatoes are an option. Making tomato sauce is definitely an option. One of the things that I experimented with last year was to dry the tomatoes and then powder the dried tomatoes so that I had like a tomato powder that I could sprinkle on eggs and in sauces. That was a great way to use tomatoes that I had never done before. So begin thinking about those kind of options. Preservation of our harvests, I think, is something that many gardeners don't spend enough time learning how to do. And then ultimately they end up with so many tomatoes on the counter that they give them away or they begin rotting and they throw them away or put them in the compost pile, preferably the compost pile. But if you anticipate that big harvest and figure out what method is going to work best for you and then learn what you can do with that method, now, when you get the big harvest, you have a way to save those tomatoes. I don't can tomatoes much anymore. I've canned in the past. But if you like canning, especially with the bigger tomatoes, canning is a great option. You just have the mason jars, you put in your tomatoes, you add a little ascorbic acid to keep the pH low, you put them in a water bath canner, and then you put them on your shelf, and you've got tomatoes available for many months after that. But that's not the kind of thing that if you wait until you've got a bushel of tomatoes on your counter that you think, oh, maybe I'll can these. And then you have to go get all the materials. Get all the materials ahead of time. Get the pots, get the jar lifters. If that's something you're interested in, figure out how to do it well in advance of harvesting that first tomato so that when that tomato comes, you're well ahead of the game and you can definitely save everything you grow. And you can still give it away. It's just you're avoiding throwing it away, which really can be a big issue. Thank you so much, Outlier Gardener. I appreciate that. Thank you so much for another informative live. You're very lucky. This is what I love to do on Mondays. So glad you're here. And I do appreciate that contribution to help me with my garden and the future videos that are ahead. Big Wheel Dog is saying I'm rooting strawberry runners to put into my green stock. Any issues interplanting them with my herbs? Um, it depends on the herbs. So uh, near one of my strawberry beds where I've got my strawberries growing in raised beds, I keep my beds exclusively strawberries so that when the runners start going around, I can just fill out the bed with new strawberry plants. But the reason I bring it up is because nearby that I have my herb garden, a long bed with sage and thyme, and I've got dill that I grow there this year. I'll be growing some fennel and tarragon. And I don't use a lot of tarragon in my diet, but I had this tarragon plant. It got huge. It was 4 feet tall. The roots were beginning to overtake the thyme. And I ripped it all out this last week because it was just too big and it was interfering too much with the plants nearby. And so the thyme can now grow. I love thyme much more than I like the tarragon. When you intersperse plants, you have to anticipate how big that plant is going to get. I didn't anticipate that the tarragon was going to get that big. If it was growing in one of my strawberry beds, the strawberries wouldn't have a chance. Strawberries that would be growing around the thyme plants would have a chance. Growing dill in a strawberry bed works because the dill has a long, thin stem, and you can put something like that interspersed with the strawberries. The sage gets pretty bushy. And so the sage wouldn't work in a strawberry patch. It would shade out the strawberries, and it too would take a lot of space that runners might be able to use better. So it depends on the herb. It depends on how the herb grows. And so something like dill, I think, is ideal for growing in a strawberry bed, and neither are really going to interfere with the other. If you're using the herbs and strawberries in your green stock, I would keep them separate. I would grow the herbs in one of the pockets and I would grow strawberries in a different pocket. Because as the roots develop within that container of the green stock, they will interfere with each other. So I would not interplant them in the same cell, but you could definitely interplant them in the same green stock. So you could have one level that's all strawberries and another level that's all herbs. You can go every other cell is an herb and every other cell is a strawberry. Absolutely, that's definitely an option that you could take when you're doing in a green stock. But it all does come down to which plant is growing and whether it will interfere or not. So, hey, Rick, good morning. Good early morning to you. Nice to see you here. And I guess you can't sleep tonight. So you can catch up on anything that you might have missed. I haven't seen you comment since then. So always nice to see you here giving up your sleep for us. Dan says, I have to do the same. I got a mixed container of herbs last year. I thought one of them was lavender, planted it in front yard with the rest of the lavender. It's out of control, need to pull. And this is one of those things that as gardeners, we are so resistant to, is getting rid of the plants that are just too much. Even a plant that we wanted, like tarragon. I love tarragon with chicken, but the plant just got too overwhelming. And because it got so big, it wasn't as flavorful anymore as when it was a nice young plant. So it was a relatively easy decision for me to pull it out. Anything you put in that takes over and becomes more of a worry, go ahead and pull it out. It can be a tough decision, but it can make a big difference. Even tomato plants. I like to put my tomato plants relatively close together. So I'll space my tomato plants about 18 inches apart and then grow them vertically up trellises. That's enough space because I'm pruning off those lower branches to get the air circulation. And as the plant grows, I'm pruning off the suckers. And this is another aspect of growing tomatoes. Those suckers, those little leaves that begin to appear in the crook between a branch and the stem, those suckers can grow into full-size vines. If you let all those suckers grow, the plant can become overwhelming. It can take over a trellis. And so, as long as I stay on top of it and prune off those suckers, I'll leave a few of them so that I typically have, by the end of the season, 3 or 4 main stems. And some of those started off as suckers. That's an important way to grow a lot of tomatoes in a small space. You're pruning them as they're growing and you're fitting them to the trellis you have. But if a tomato just starts taking over and is interfering with other tomatoes, sometimes you got to really prune it hard. You got to cut it back. And there have been times in the middle of the season when I've pulled a tomato plant because it was interfering so much with the ones next to it. Now, I'll generally plant multiple plants of the same variety. So if I'm growing black cherry tomatoes, for instance, I might put in 3 black cherry plants side by side, 18 inches apart. If they become so overwhelming, if I get way behind in my pruning and managing of the tomato plants, sometimes it's easier to just cut that second plant off at the ground, pull it out, and now give more space for those other 2 to continue growing. And so, lavender is another one that I have in that herb bed I was talking about, but it hasn't grown big enough yet. I've got it at the end separated from the sage, but potentially it could get big enough that it could start growing with the sage, which now means I need to either prune the sage or prune the lavender because they begin interfering with each other. Those are all issues that we need to confront on a regular basis. And sometimes the decision is a tough decision. But as I've said before, I've killed thousands and thousands of plants. But that's because in most cases, they had to go so that others would survive and thrive. And that's really a big aspect of all of our garden, especially tomatoes. I don't generally thin out the fruit on my tomatoes, but that is a practice if you're wanting those really big tomatoes and you have a short season. Consider plucking off some of the flowers that develop after that fruit is growing, and consider thinning out some of the fruit, because if you have a lot of big fruit on the plant, that plant has to support the growth of all that big fruit. And if you got a short season, the season might not be long enough for all of that fruit to fully develop. But if you prune off some of that fruit, that allows more of the plant's energy to go to the fruit that's remaining, making it bigger. And often it'll begin ripening slightly earlier than if the plant was loaded with a lot of fruit. So keep that in mind. Pruning is an important aspect of maintaining and managing your tomatoes and really getting to the point of a full good harvest. I could talk about tomatoes all day long, and I've got videos that show how I do pruning, and I have videos that show how I do my trellising. So if you haven't seen those videos, by all means, go to the Gardener Scott page and on YouTube and do a quick search of Gardener Scott tomato on my YouTube page, and you'll see a whole bunch of videos that'll pop up. I'm going to be back next week, and we'll be talking about more about what's going on in the garden and throw out all this wonderful information I love to talk about. I hope to see you there. Same time, same place next week. And until we get to that point, have a great gardening week. And of course, enjoy gardening.